Welcome to Grow Fast, Grow Smart, the PI Playbook by Xcelerator, the podcast exclusively designed to help personal injury law firms reach their full potential and serve their clients better. Let's jump in.
Have you ever wanted to know exactly how many viable PI cases are walking out your door because of missed opportunities during intake? Welcome back to the PI Playbook, the podcast where we explore the strategies and tools that help personal injury law firms level up their practice. I'm your host, Stephanie Koehler from Xcelerator Law Firm Consultants. In this episode, you'll discover 3 game-changing insights. First, why the cases you're rejecting might actually be your most profitable opportunities. Second, how AI can catch and rescue lost leads in real time before they call your competitor. And third, what the highest converting firms are doing differently with their intake teams that you can implement today. I'm thrilled to introduce Hayden and David Haskins. Hayden is the CEO and co-founder, and David serves as president of Speed AI. Speed AI is a patent-pending AI agent that monitors intake calls 24/7, spots issues as they arrive, provides real-time coaching for your intake staff, and can rescue lost leads before they're gone forever. David and Hayden, welcome to the PI Playbook.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to be here.
What an intro. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited about our conversation today, so I wanted to set you guys up in a good mood. So first, tell our listeners a little about yourselves and the beginnings of Speed AI.
Sure. We've been in legal marketing since I started in my friend's firm in 2009, and then started an agency in 2013 doing marketing externally for other firms.
I was employee 0 there. So it's, essentially the entirety of my professional career has been in legal marketing and intake.
And like anyone who's consulting or doing marketing or lead generation for a law firm or frankly any small business, we see the lead to sale funnel problem over and over and over again at different firms and at different ways that they are sort of like leaking leads. So we would offer suggestions and tips, but we really didn't have a formal program until we built one out in 2020 to start coaching our clients on how to do intake effectively, how to increase their conversion rates, building out their tech stack. And one of the things we were doing is we were auditing 5 calls per week per agent. So it's a very time-consuming process, but you need that in order to maintain quality. And that's
in our intake, we called it the Intake Xcelerator program. And in that program, one of the things that I would do is kind of go in and connect their tech stack together, right? So one of the requirements was we would make clients start tracking their leads using a CRM. Usually that would be something like Lead Docket. And then I would go and integrate it with their case management. Now I have a whole soapbox on how this software can't talk to this software and all that kind of thing. But throughout that time, like I had noticed that one of the big time consuming tasks that our coaches had to do was just manually reviewing those calls, doing those secret shops and listening to those calls and grading them. And at that time, I was getting frustrated with a lot of the tech out there and the inability to integrate. I also have a kind of like this side hobby where I do pro se TCPA litigation. So I built kind of my own case management there that I was using to manage the cases that I was bringing. And through that, I started playing around with AI, first just to expose like kind of like the potential for bias. And, to be honest, I was a bit bearish on AI as a whole. Once I started realizing kind of how powerful it could be, as long as you kind of train it right, we were sitting in the pool one day and we're talking about, all the time that it takes the agents to do our coaches to do their jobs and some of what the inefficiencies were. I was like, hey, what if we could just have AI analyze those calls? Then our coaches could maybe review agent performance after the fact. So that kind of started a chain of events where we just, at first it was just, a little transcript. We'd redact it, put it in, then we would just ask it questions. And over about the span of maybe a year and a half, kept refining that system and refining how we did that analysis and what the different factors and criteria were on which an intake call should be analyzed. And it was, beginning of this year that we realized that there is the analysis was good enough and that it was accurate enough, and B, that there was a need in the market for this. And we kind of started building in earnest at the beginning of this year, although we had kind of like a kind of hacked together version of it, with spreadsheets and Zapiers and, all this kind of stuff, no code solutions. But that's kind of how the story, how it came about. It arose out of a real need that we saw, a real pain point that we experienced here at the agency. And we knew that firms were experiencing that too.
So what you're saying is that do hang out in a pool because that's where the good ideas are coming from. Okay, you guys have shared so much great information. I have a couple of questions right off the bat. So for our audience, I want you to just define what lead leak is from your perspective. So just to kind of level set with everyone, what are we talking about when we talk specifically about lead leak related to intake and ultimately your product?
Yeah. Lead leak for us is defined as anything that a law firm does or doesn't do in their process that causes them to lose out on a potential sign up. That could be issues with training, could be not properly vetting all of the facts of a case and sort of cutting somebody off too early, could be misunderstanding the facts and suggesting, we have a lead leak that was a workers' comp firm. And they told the person, no, what you're describing is actually an employment issue. Go Google labor lawyer, and that's what you need. Is Speed AI was able to identify that was incorrect. And even just this morning, we onboarded a firm and we were listening to a couple calls just before we got on, and something is wrong in their phone system. There is a technical glitch where it gets transferred from the front desk or from the answering service into the intake department. And it just gives a computer, sort of voice that says there has been an internal error and hangs the phone up. So these are potential leads that if you don't connect the dots, you might have lost out on. So there's different categories, but one of the most surprising ones is technical errors.
So you recommend, I think lots of firms know that listening to their intake calls will do lots of great things, right? They'll help them identify technical errors or kind of issues within the sort of scripts or types of follow-ups you're getting. You guys talked about how you've been refining kind of a set of criteria that intake calls need to meet. Tell me about that process. Like what fed into that and how does it evolve?
Yeah. To be honest, it was about a year and a half, almost 2 years of trial and error that kind of, led us to the system that we use now. There's a lot of things. There's, is it a valid lead? Is it in the firm's wanted case types? Is this a potential new client calling about a new case, or is this an existing client calling about an existing case? What could the agent have done better? Let's score the agent. Let's score the overall experience of the caller. Let's score the quality of the case. Let's, see how long they were on hold, how long it took the agent to answer the phone. Let's see what their stated marketing source was. Let's have the AI grade itself and tell you the reasoning behind these scores. Coaching opportunities, lead leaks, defining what injuries the potential new client sustained. Each one of the fields that someone could see if they log into our dashboard and they kind of look at their own calls, each one of those was weeks of kind of just, hey, let's try to produce an analysis for this particular criteria. Just honestly going through trial and error. I remember a time when, we were really, like I would go and find 10 to 12 example calls, and then I'd have different versions of our analysis run each one. And then I would benchmark them, each different category of criteria against the other, criteria and just see which one got it more accurate. It was a lot of manual review. And I think that that's one of the things that firms struggle with, in the intake accelerator when it was all manual. The advantage that we were giving firms there is the folks who were winning at intake were the firms that had somebody who was listening to calls, at least a portion of them. And it's a manual process and it takes time, but that was what was helping them win at intake. Intake Accelerator, the manual coaching and analysis program, was giving firms that same advantage. And when we realized that you don't actually have to spend all that time doing that, AI can actually just do that. We kind of, had to get started building a system through which an AI could produce that analysis.
Great. So it sounds like you guys had lots of experience listening and working with clients, but then you added that extra layer of AI to make everything so much easier. So for my next question, that means adding in AI allows a lot more calls to be listened to and responded to and categorized. So I'm looking for some examples and fun stories. When you look at the intake calls you've analyzed, what are some things that surprised you about what firms were passing on that they wouldn't have noticed if they hadn't had this type of review?
Wow, it's all over the board. We had one firm that realized that their answering service was not sending leads through if it wasn't a good call. So somebody's on the phone for a minute or so, they get fed up and they leave. The answering service wasn't reporting that. I told them, I said, you're probably getting billed for it. There's that one. I mean, a lot of times we see people not investigating all the facts of a case. There was one firm who got a huge sign up. The agent asked the gentleman, which call's only a minute and a half long. When they got to, "Are you injured?" He said, "No." And they said, "Okay, well, we'll take your information. And if the lawyers, like it, they'll call you back." Well, the guy had been calling about an accident that his employees were in. So the speed flagged that. The intake manager called that person back, was able to rescue the case. And they had not only a driver and a passenger, they were not at fault. And the at fault driver was a tractor trailer. And it was their biggest sign up of the month. And it was just for the fact that Speed it didn't have all the facts of the case. It saw that there was a miscommunication. That's really what we see a lot of times in lead rescue, is there was some sort of miscommunication or gap that caused them to leak that lead.
Yeah, I remember the morning. It was actually before we publicly launched, and we had that firm was running our software as a beta tester, and he called me all excited. He was like, "Hey, just so you know, whatever you want to charge for the software, this is going to cover it." But I'll tell you my favorite lead rescue that I've ever seen, at least since we've launched and been in a lot more firms, is it was a call that happened in, I believe, April of this year. It might have been a month before that. But the call was in April 2025. Caller mentions an accident that occurred in October of 2023. And the intake agent just did some quick mental math and said 23 to 25, that's 2 years. "I'm sorry, but you don't have a case." She said, "Your statute of limitations is expired." I don't even think she gave him the number to the state bar. And lead rescue caught that and said, "Hey," it did the math and it said, "Hey, actually, this person has 6 more months, according to the statute." Even knew, based on the highways that he had mentioned in the call, what the state was, and then looked up the state statute and said, "Hey, hold on, he's still got 6 months." So they were able to call him back and kind of smooth it over, say, "Sorry, we made a mistake," and sign him up. So that was probably one of my favorites. Yeah, I'm surprised every day the type of things that it ends up flagging.
Well, that's incredible. And also AI very helpful for doing math for lots of people. So I'm glad it was there to save the day. So you're working with firms and they have been losing cases. Your tool comes in, they're getting flags that lead rescue pieces, and kind of walk us through what happens at the firm. Like, how does Speed AI make the awareness of a leaked case, and then kind of where does it go from there, sort of step by step?
Yeah. So there's a few things that happen. First, the analysis is going to review if it's a lead and if it's within their list of wanted cases. If it is, it'll review if the lead was lost at intake or if it was signed up. If it was lost and it's recoverable, our software will say, "Hey, here's one that can be recovered," and it'll trigger a notification and an email to send off to whoever is subscribed to those notifications at the firm. But, kind of from a bigger picture, what usually ends up happening is there's a lot more visibility into an area where there wasn't a lot of visibility, right? So traditionally you spend money to advertise, the phone rings, a certain set amount of those phone calls result in cases. And then, at the end of those cases, the firm gets paid out. Whatever happens on that phone call is kind of in the ether. Folks, unless they were manually listening to those calls, there's no insight there. And what ends up happening is there's a lot more attention paid to that process. There's a lot more visibility into what's happening in intake. And I've seen firms, I've seen firms completely overhaul their intake department and intake process based on the feedback that Speed AI is giving them. I don't say this lightly, but I did find out about one person that was terminated as a result. But after listening to the call, she was extremely rude to somebody who was not in a great situation, and calling in for help. And so, I had to ultimately agree with it, with his decision. But it's just a lot of visibility into a piece of the firm that's been opaque for forever.
And the other thing is that we were talking with Mickey and showing her, it can also surface the great calls.
Yeah.
We've seen that intake tends to be that department that doesn't get attention until it's bad. So Speed's able to also surface the best of the calls. We have this one filter that we create for people called the high five view. That's every call that's over an 80 or an 85 in the agent score. And then you also typically get a lot of signups in those calls. And firms are using that to give people sort of the criticism sandwich of good feedback, some things you need to work on, and then follow up with good feedback. Also, other firms are using it for their Monday morning stand-ups, just to say, hey, Jimmy did a great job on this call. Look at this, is a 95, A grade case. He signed it up on the first call. And other firms are using that view for training, to say, you've got your training, you got our operation and process. Go sit down and listen to all the high fives in the dashboard so you can hear, what these examples of good calls are.
Glad that you mentioned insight because, at the end of the day, whenever firms are looking at their signed cases and their marketing and those kind of everything in between, intake is such an important piece. And so when you have insights there, you really have insights into the health of your firm overall. So you mentioned a couple of ways that firms were adjusting their intake processes or teams based on on those insights. Which of those, or maybe another, do you think had the biggest impact on performance? Like for our listeners, if they're really saying like, I'm going to use this tool, it's going to tell me something. Now I have information. What do I do with it? What are some examples of firms that you worked with that they did something that made a huge difference?
But I don't want to name names, but it was
Please don't.
It was our first paying customer. They were a beta tester. They're somewhat large, but he called and said, hey, I went and bought a Mac Mini and I'm tasked with overhauling our intake department after what we've learned here. He went and bought a Mac Mini and put a TV on the wall in his desk, and he just has Speed AI up on the wall right across from his desk. So you can see it at all times. And, talking about visibility, I think that's as visible as it can get. And, what I've seen over there is, their scores trend upwards over time. The amount of leads that need to be rescued trend down over time. That was one firm that they really did need to overhaul a lot of how they were doing intake, just because it was not conducive to a good client experience.
Yeah, I've seen firms pull more of their intake onshore instead of just sort of defaulting to like, oh, we can always just get, cheaper labor offshore. They're pulling more of their primary intake onshore. And also they tend to reduce their usage of outsourced call centers as well because of some of the disconnect. When somebody's answering the phone, no matter how good they're trained, like if they're answering the phone for 300 different firms, there's a disconnect in like connecting to the firm and the firm's values and their casework. You don't ever get those little moments in a phone call where somebody's like, oh, you're at a motorcycle wreck. Jimmy is in-house. He's the one that does all our motorcycle cases. He rides a Harley himself. Those little touch points that help, connect people to the firms.
So whether someone's running a large firm using outsourced calling, or they're a small firm that's, solo practice, maybe a little bit of help, how does Speed AI help those two different audiences? So what's the advantage for small firms and what's the advantage for big firms?
I've seen it help. When we first created this, I thought, hey, this is going to be a fit for some of the larger firms, right? Larger call volume, less opportunity for, visibility into those calls. It's harder to audit, 20,000 calls than it is to audit 300, right? But I've also seen some of the smaller firms really take to this because it is a way that they can scale their intake agents' abilities and quickly get new intake agents up to speed, especially firms that are kind of coming through that growth phase from, going from like one attorney and a paralegal to maybe 2 or 3 attorneys, 2 or 3 paralegals, and maybe one intake person just starts answering the phone. It really helps them get from, it helps an intake agent get from good to great a lot faster than if you were just kind of waiting until something went wrong or something went right.
Absolutely. So here we're going to touch a somewhat more sensitive topic. So you're analyzing client intake calls that could contain personal information, medical details, and of course, legal matters. So how do you ensure that the data stays secure? And what should firms know about confidentiality when working like AI tools like Speed AI?
Yes. So, from the first time we ever did any sort of transcript or call analysis, we always, at the beginning, we had to manually redact, client information, names, phone numbers, addresses, street names, all those things. So we had to just painstakingly go through and manually do that because I didn't even trust, any of these third party redaction services to keep the data private. Very like non-trusting of AI companies, just like as a default. But since then, there have been, a lot of developments in what you can and can't get these AI companies to do. And one of the examples of that is a policy called zero data retention. So if you are using one of these, AI companies and you're able to obtain, HIPAA compliance and zero data retention through them, from that point, essentially what happens with an analysis is we send a call to them for analysis. They send back a response and then they delete all the associated data, 100% of it. They're contractually obligated to do so. One of the banes of my existence over the last 2.5 months is we are undergoing just like a very intensive audit for SOC 2, for HIPAA compliance. The attorney-client privilege has kind of always been at the forefront of, of what we're doing here. I've known since day one that was going to be one of the number one things that folks ask. Is it secure? How do I protect the attorney-client privilege? And so, every step of the way, we've been overly cautious in engineering for that, to the point where now, we are nearing the end of our HIPAA audit, nearing the end of our SOC 2 audit. And, in the next couple of weeks, all the information about, our tech stack, how we protect client information, available on a trust center on our website for anybody to come and review or, have their IT team review. One thing that I would, caution folks with is if you're going to go try and maybe do this yourself, we talk about manually doing it yourself when we give kind of demos of the software. If you are going to do that, redact everything before you ever type it into a large language model. These companies, no secret that if it's free or cheap and it's technology, you and your data are the product. So don't put any sensitive information into an LLM unless you are protected by a HIPAA compliant tech stack, as well as BAAs, zero data retention policies, and the like.
Well, it's good. I'm glad you guys are, even though you started fairly, the last year and a half and you've been experimenting, you've got those Zapier integrations that you started with, that the product seems like it's maturing, and in that way, taking data compliance all the way through it. What's something from the tech part, the AI part, that you guys learned in the last couple of years that really surprised you about building a product like this?
It was one thing kind of early on where, I was experimenting a lot with AI, trying to get it to go outside of its normal guidelines. But one thing that I did realize is that if you give AI a list and say, pick only from this list, it's actually not good at that. Even though it is a machine and it should be good at something like that, it's not.
That is true. That's why no matter how many times you tell it to not use an M dash, there will be one there for you in its response, promising you not to do it. So that's great. Okay, so let's talk about the future of intake. Your company has a really interesting perspective over across of different firms, different parts of the country, of really what's happening with intake calls. Tell me about things that you've seen that are changing over the time that you've been listening or having intake access, and then what's happening in the future. Where do you think this is going? Where will the implementation of AI tools influence how firms take cases or even how intake calls themselves are run?
I have stated, and I haven't been proven wrong yet, that the initial call that someone makes to a personal injury firm is the highest economic value phone call in the entire world of sales. And there's no other situation where someone could become a 5, 6, or even 7-figure customer with $0 out of their pocket, paid on a contingency basis, and can be signed up as that customer in 10 to 20 minutes. There are a lot of automated solutions that are promising to replace your intake or reduce your labor costs. We have gone the complete opposite direction. We believe that our tool, and as we build onto it, is built to give humans superhuman powers. So it's built to assist humans in that human to human connection, where frankly, if someone is calling a personal injury firm, it's likely one of the worst situations they've dealt with in their life. I don't think that, frankly, the technology isn't there yet, and the humanity isn't there yet to where people are going to want to talk to a robot. Now, that being said, there are some great tools out there for automating, part of that. Like Attorney Share's got a great tool where if you have a case that you would reject, you can patch it through to an AI that will then ask it some more questions, qualify it, and create a referral out on the network for you. I definitely believe in using an AI as a replacement to a voicemail if you're not going to answer the call or if all the agents are busy. That's another great use. But I don't see the core interaction, which is a person calling out for help in the time of need. I would say it's up there close to, not as urgent, but up there close to a 911 call in how sensitive that situation could be.
Yeah. We hear that usually when someone gets in an accident, there are 3 calls they make in a specific order. It's first EMS, then to their spouse or family member, and then to a lawyer. So, if I was going to call and schedule an appointment to get my HVAC fixed or my roof fixed or my gutters done, and I had a robot answer the phone, I'd probably be okay with that, especially if it's helpful and kind of guide me through it. But if I had just witnessed my 9-year-old playing out in front of the house and get hit by a driver, I wouldn't give it a second thought if I was going to talk to the robot about what to do in that situation. I'd just call another firm.
Yeah. I love this. This is good. So I'm really resonating with it. I enjoy humans as well. And I love the idea of places where AI can enhance the good work that people do when they show empathy and concern in the world of PI. I mean, that is such a powerful connector between people who are really in need and people who need help and the best way to get them that help. So amazing. I'm on board. So here's my question. What are law firms risking when they move to AI responses within intake, or sort of when they decide to use the robot, so to speak, that they probably wouldn't frame it in that way? Like, what's at risk?
There's a specific example that I heard recently from who was just testing a call out, and we did a sample call, and the firm does a considerable amount of Spanish cases. They implemented an AI that, purports to be, to speak 30 different languages. And someone calls in and is speaking in Spanish, and he's asking for help in Spanish. And there was a phone prompt that says, hey, press 1 for English, 2 for Spanish. You press 2. And then the AI answers it and is telling him, I'm sorry, I can only help you in English. Just imagine if you called a law firm and then they had a robot just telling you, hey, I'm sorry, I can only help you in Spanish. Like you'd just hang up and call the next law firm that has someone there ready to speak your language and ready to help you, right? It's the same thing as if you just had no bilingual staff.
For that, it's like the problem isn't that the person answering doesn't speak Spanish. It's that they didn't even know to transfer the call to someone else in the office that does speak Spanish. Like the AI doesn't know that. They don't know who else is in the office that can handle,
So lacking that sophistication to understand, like you said, I loved your example about the attorney who rides a Harley, right? So it's like sort of contextual awareness of the firm, which is lacking in a lot of, could be lacking in a lot of ways that an in-house intake person would know, and they would get trained on. So missing on both levels. That's really cool. All right. So if you could sit down with a firm owner for 5 minutes and give them one piece of advice about their intake, what would you tell them?
Listen to your calls. I mean, if you've got 5 minutes, we can actually onboard you into the system in less than 5 minutes, and we can scan a month's worth of calls. Yeah. Listen to your phone calls. I had one attorney I was talking to. I gave him that advice, and I said, he had CallRail. He already had calls recorded, and I said, you've never done it before. Just sit down, take your lunch at your desk, open the CallRail dashboard up, and just listen until you find something that you didn't like. And he called me back like 2-3 days later, and he's like, David, that was the best advice I've gotten in 20 plus years practicing law. And I was like, oh man, what did you find? He says, I heard this call, which was a very drastic birth injury, he said, and my team just passed it around between a couple people and then took a message. He said, it sounded like somebody working at McDonald's. And he was devastated by it. He was very sad because he lost that big case. And I said, how many calls did you have to listen to before you found that one? And he said, it's the first call I've ever listened to. And we talked through it. He still tried to reach back out to that person and sign the case up, but it had been about a week and a half at that point. But in the end, we focused on the positive. Well, if you fix this now, the value of that case, even though it's gone, would pale in comparison to the improvements that you're going to make in the firm, going forward in the future.
Thank you both for sharing your story of Speed AI, all of these incredible insights about intake calls. I know our firms will take some really cool insights and ideas.
If you want to find out more about what Speed AI can do in your firm, come find our booth at the Accelerate Your Average Fee conference.
Or online at speed.ai.
Thank you both. It was great.
Thank you.
Cool.
That's all for today's episode of Grow Fast, Grow Smart, the PI Playbook by Xcelerator. Be sure to subscribe for more tips and tricks on growing your law firm the smart way.